Good afternoon, and welcome back to the Michelangelo Signorile Show here on SiriusXM Progress. My name's Joe Sudbay, and I'm really excited right now to be joined by the political director of Daily Kos, David Neer. Welcome back to the show, David.
Thank you for having me back, Joe.
I always enjoy the opportunity when I guest host that you can come on and we can do deep dives into the elections around the country. And we geek out about it. I love doing it. And but today, David, we have to talk about something else first. We will dive into some of the elections, but it's something that you have been covering very closely at Daily Kos Elections, and it is how changes are happening in elections. And that involves a couple things. There have been changes in primary dates because of the coronavirus, but there's also been an effort by a lot of states to make it easier to vote. And those efforts have been challenged across the country by Republicans. You are tracking it. I just actually tweeted a new database that Daily Kos Elections, a new spreadsheet. You're tracking over 40 federal and state lawsuits over coronavirus-related changes to 2020 elections and voting procedures. I mean, this is a whole new kind of area that needs to be tracked. So let's dig into that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
We pivoted really. Oh, I'm sorry, Joe.
No, go ahead.
Please,
Go ahead. I want you to
continue.
just start. Yeah.
Sure, yes. So we pivoted really from that day-to-day coverage of elections, which, don't worry, we're still doing, to covering election procedures and how those are changing. And of course, everyone is focused on Trump's insane rants and tweets about voting by mail, though, of course, I'm sure as you saw, his press secretary, it turns out, voted by mail 10 times in the last decade. But at the state level, where elections are actually run, there is quite a lot that's going on. And as you mentioned, some states are moving in the direction of making it easier and safer to vote during the pandemic, but a lot of states aren't. And they're going to have to be dragged into it, really kicking and screaming in a lot of cases. And voting rights advocates across the country, including groups like the NAACP, the ACLU, of course, Democratic super lawyer Mark Elias, have been filing lawsuit after lawsuit to try to ensure a number of important changes to the way that elections are carried out. They want people to be able to vote from home, which means that you should be able to request an absentee ballot, also known as a mail ballot, without having an excuse. That is really a top priority. They want people to be able to mail ballots, to postmark them as late as Election Day. Because think about it, when you do your taxes, you postmark your taxes by April 15th, or this year, July 15th. In a lot of states, however, your ballot has to be received by Election Day. And so that winds up with a lot of votes getting tossed out because the ballots arrive too late. So these are two of the big topics in these cases. Like you said, there's 40 cases raging around the country right now in federal court and state court. We're tracking all of them. And so far, the plaintiffs are having a lot of success. Courts are, for the most part, ruling in favor of expanding voting access and making elections safer this year.
Right. And it's that, and that's really important to have that level of success. And their efforts, though, are being met by fierce challenges. I know when you're looking at a couple of states, one state I particularly am interested in is Texas, where there have been challenges at the federal and state level. The state courts are controlled by Republicans. A federal district court judge last week said, yes, in fact, Texas voters can use, the fear of contracting coronavirus as a reason to get their absentee ballot. And of course, the Attorney General, Ken Paxton, who himself is under indictment for federal security frauds, I always like to add, is going to run right to the Fifth Circuit on that one, because the Fifth Circuit is, it's a very conservative court and has always done his bidding. So what are some of the other places you're watching, David?
So Texas, definitely one of the most important, like you said, the that the ruling allowing all voters to seek an absentee ballot, that has been stayed for the moment. I'm not terribly optimistic, like you said, because of the conservative nature, the hyper-conservative Trumpian nature of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is now hearing that case. But other states present perhaps better turf. California, I think, really bears watching. It's obviously not a swing state in the presidential election, but it was critical in 2018 for Democrats, who picked up 7 Republican-held House seats there, and Democrats are going to try to defend those gains, going to try to win back that 25th district that they just lost in the special election. California took the biggest step so far, which is Governor Gavin Newsom, a Democrat, of course, issued an executive order saying that the state would send ballots to every voter for the November general election. Now, I want to take a moment to clarify something. A lot of election officials in a lot of states have said they're sending absentee ballot applications to voters, which means that voters need to fill out the application, send the application back, and then wait to get their absentee ballot. California is completely eliminating that step, which is a great move because it saves a lot of money and a lot of difficulty and increases the chance of someone actually getting a ballot in their hands. And so that's what's moving forward in California. And of course, taking their cues from Donald Trump, Republicans have filed lawsuits, 2 lawsuits, in fact, against this move by Newsom. And one of the lawsuits is from none other than Darrell Issa, alleged car thief, former congressman, now waging a comeback in a different congressional district because he retired from his previous district because he knew he was going to lose last year. And in fact, Democrats did indeed flip that seat. So I read over those lawsuits from Republicans. I wasn't too impressed with the arguments that they made. I think that in California already is a state where voting by mail is already very popular. So this kind of just accelerates the process of moving it to a fully vote by mail state. And hopefully we will see other states follow suit.
I hope so. And 2 points. One is the only reason Darrell Issa can run for that 50th congressional seat, which is vacant, is because the incumbent, Duncan Hunter, was convicted of felonies. So he had to retire. So, I mean, the corruption, it's unbelievable. The other thing is, in D.C., actually, where I live, we all got the absentee ballot request. You had to request the absentee. You had to fill it out and send it back. And it's a pain. Like, I could do it online, but I had to print it. I had to do a PDF, or I had to print it out. And once you see PDF or printer, it just thwarts a lot of people. So what California is doing is so important. And it should just be what's done. Because several states, David, and I think this is important, several states already do vote by mail. And it's not like this is a new concept that's just being created right now. There are states that do it and have done it successfully for years.
Absolutely. And I want to emphasize that one of the states that more recently moved to vote by mail is Utah. So you can't claim that this is some ploy to help Democrats. Obviously, dark red, ultra-conservative Utah is moving in this direction. But Washington and Oregon in particular have had great success and higher turnout as a result for years. It also saves money because you don't need to operate in-person polling places. These are all the reasons, aside from safety, that vote by mail is such a good system. But I do want to take a moment to say that it is not a panacea, because there are a lot of people whom vote by mail does not reach or cannot reach. And that would include anyone who lacks a home address, or someone who recently moved and the mail just simply didn't reach them. There are a lot of communities where simply sending ballots is not going to be enough. And in fact, many of the communities that make up the Democratic base tend to be communities that there are more difficulties surrounding implementing voting by mail. So that's why it's still important for jurisdictions to maintain safe in-person voting centers, and also to have early voting. So that way people have a chance to vote over a period of a few weeks, so that not everyone is jammed into the polls on election day like we saw in that disaster in Wisconsin last month.
Right, absolutely right. And, you'd think we are always so proud of our democracy and how important it is. And the fundamental part of our democracy is voting one person, one vote. And you'd think that would be something that is elected officials strive for. Some do, as you mentioned in Utah, some Republicans actually did, but it's really been such an effort by the Republicans to thwart it. Right before you came on, David, I was reading from a new Guardian expose about a major dark money group that's led by Leonard Leo from the who was with the Federalist Society, and they've gotten millions of dollars from the Koch brothers, Betsy DeVos's family, and it's actually called Honest Elections Project, and its whole raison d'etre is to prevent honest elections because they don't want people voting.
That's absolutely right. And Republicans realized quite some time ago that, generally speaking, they benefited from minority rule, whether that's the Senate, which disproportionately favors small and rural states, the Electoral College, which 2 times in the past 2 decades handed the GOP a victory for the White House, despite their candidates losing the majority of the popular vote, whether it's gerrymandering, where in state after state, Republican candidates win fewer votes statewide, but still win majorities in state legislatures. The GOP has no problem with clinging to power by winning a minority of the vote and using every system possible to ensure that. And that is really a recipe for a long-term or maybe even a shorter-term disaster because it creates a crisis in democratic legitimacy. The problem is I don't think that the Republican Party as a whole cares about democracy anymore. It only cares about power. So we really only have one party that is a pro-small d democracy party, and that's the Democrats.
Absolutely right. And where it's really been on display, I think of 2 states that took action, having the voters participate in changing the way elections are done. It was Michigan in 2018 and Florida in 2018. And in Michigan, they made same-day registration. They did a couple of other changes that would have made it easier for people to participate. And the Republicans in the legislature tried to undo it. So you actually had the voters participating in the democratic process, change the rules to make it easier to vote, and the Republicans in their legislature, which they have because of gerrymandering, out of control proportions, tried to undo it. And then what they did in Florida with Amendment 4, where it was an amendment that passed by an overwhelming majority to allow for people with felony records to vote. And they basically created a poll tax that was struck down this week by a federal district court judge in that state. And it's not just, so it's what they're trying to do is manipulate the system that exists. But then when the voters of your state tell you what they want and you try and undo it, that is really so egregious.
It's unbelievably egregious. And I'll do you one better. In state after state, where voters have passed these progressive reforms at the ballot box because the gerrymandered legislatures won't take up these issues, what's happened is that Republicans in those same legislatures have then tried to change the rules to make it harder to put new ballot measures on the ballot.
Right.
And even more insidious than that, Joe, is that they have come up with really cynical, devious methods that disproportionately make it harder for those on the left to get measures on the ballot versus those on the right. For instance, one very sneaky thing that they have been changing or trying to change in a number of states is saying, let's say you need to get 100,000 signatures statewide. Well, they say you have to collect them from every single congressional district. Well, what did we just say about the congressional districts? They're badly gerrymandered, and most of them are Republican and rural and sprawling. And you go try collecting signatures in, a sprawling rural area. Ballot measures get on the ballot in large part because the signature gatherers go to cities to collect them, where you can find lots of voters all in one place. But so imagine you're trying to canvass for signatures for increasing the minimum wage or some other liberal measure out in a rural area. That's going to be a lot damn harder. But for conservatives, it's not going to be so hard because you'll still find plenty of Republicans in cities.
Right, right. And what's often interesting too, David, is when those measures get on the ballot, they are supported by Republicans in rural areas. They are supported by voters in rural areas. Missouri's a great example of that. They've passed a number of progressive pieces of legislation at the ballot. And again, that's a state where the Republican-controlled legislature has tried to undo them. We could talk about this a lot, and we will a lot more. But I also want to talk to you, David, about some of the key states around the country. So if we can do this is Joe Sudbay here on SiriusXM Progress. I'm talking to David Neer, the political director at Daily Kos. David, if you can stick around for a few minutes, we come back on the other side of the break. Let's dig into some of the battleground states and what's happening at the Senate and with other races there, if you can do that.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we'll be back in just a few minutes here on SiriusXM Progress.
The Michelangelo Signorile Show on SiriusXM.
Welcome back to the Michelangelo Signorile Show here on SiriusXM Progress. My name's Joe Sudbay, and we are talking to David Neer, the political director at Daily Kos. We spent the last few minutes really talking about the election and how the administration of the elections has become just such a major battle across the country, trying to allow people to participate in that process in the midst of a pandemic. And of course, Republicans doing everything they can to thwart it, as they have for so long. But now I'd like to do something that David Neer and I have done many times on this show, and I know he's done it with Mike Signorile, is dive into some of the key races around the country and where things stand. And I think, David, it's fair to say one of the major changes, and we talked about this about a month and a half ago or so, that has really kind of become accepted amongst the political pundits and prognosticator crowd, is that the United States Senate is very much in play. And that is really important for 2020. And I think, and I know you at Daily Kos Elections analyze these races. What's your big picture view of the chances for Democrats to take the Senate? And then we'll dive into some of the key races.
You are spot on. There definitely has been a mood change in, I would say, the general assessment of Democrats' chances of taking over the Senate. And I am feeling as positively about that as I have all cycle right now. And what's happened is that a few races in particular that Democrats absolutely had to be competitive in have become competitive. And they are true toss-ups. I'm thinking specifically of North Carolina and, Joe, your favorite home state of Maine.
Yes.
Those are both probably the tipping point races. The party that if one party wins both of those, they're almost certainly going to control the entire Senate. Now, why has this happened? It's possible, absolutely, that the pandemic has played a role here. It's difficult to say, though. Trump's approvals, for instance, haven't really shifted a whole lot. It depends, of course, on which polls you look at. So I'm a little bit hesitant to say that the sort of general political framework has changed. What I think may be happening is that a race like North Carolina was almost always destined to become competitive. It's been a closely fought swing state for years. Even though Democrats lost it at the presidential level in 2016, they flipped the governorship. Tom Tillis, the Republican incumbent, is a freshman. He's never been all that well known or popular. He's gotten crossways with Trump, which has hurt him with Republican voters. And I'm just using this as one example, but I'm not surprised at all to see North Carolina become competitive. And same with Maine, though for a different set of reasons. We've talked about it before on this show, but Susan Collins' whole kabuki shtick of pretending to be a moderate, she really took the mask off finally with Kavanaugh in a way that people who hadn't previously seen were now able to see. And given that, Maine, swing state, maybe leans a little bit to the left. Again, it makes sense that a state like that in a very partisan and polarized era would become competitive. You throw in Arizona and Colorado, which already had been looking very good for Democrats. And there you have the 4 seats that Democrats need to net in order to flip the Senate. And that's how the picture has changed, in my view.
Really important. And a couple of things we know is that in North Carolina, a lot of polling has shown very tight race. Cal Cunningham, the Democratic nominee, up every now and then by a point or two. Really important. There's a gubernatorial race, and the governor, Roy Cooper, is actually way ahead in the polling. It always helps, I think, to have a governor who's at the top of the ticket. And in this case, a popular governor, which will be, helpful, we hope. In Maine, one of the things I always mention, I mentioned it to Mike Signorile last week, is Maine's electoral votes are allotted unlike any other state except for Nebraska. You can win 1 electoral vote for each congressional district, and then you can get 2 if you win statewide. So Maine has 4. In 2016, Donald Trump won the 2nd district. He wants that. That's what I keep hearing from people in Maine who talk to Republicans. Trump has made it very clear he intends to compete for that electoral vote again. And so he will be in Maine this fall. And what does Susan Collins do? Does she show up? Last week, Laura Trump did a Trump fundraiser in Maine, just a virtual one. Susan Collins wasn't there. We don't even know if Susan Collins voted for Trump in the primary. She won't admit it, and there was only Trump on the ballot. So it does create a problem for her. And the one that I find really fascinating is Arizona, because one of the things, David, and I know you love this too, is you start to see the Republican infighting. Democrats are always accused of infighting. We always hear Democrats in disarray. Arizona is the ultimate GOP in disarray story. We're starting to see articles in kind of like the Politico and others about how upset Trump is with Martha McSally, and he's blaming her for him doing so poorly in the state. So you've already got that fight. We usually don't see those kind of fights until October, but it's already started.
Well, that's because it's the Trump era. So there's always a fight going on, usually several dozen at once. But it's absolutely delicious. You're totally right. And here's the thing to bear in mind. Republicans often love to hate Republican senators, Republican voters, that is. And you will see folks, for instance, like a Lindsey Graham or like a Martha McSally, sporting kind of weak approval numbers with members of their own party. And while, of course, these same voters absolutely love Trump because he's their God, Emperor, King, and he can do no wrong, invariably, almost all of these will come back home because they will remember at the end of the day that they might not like Martha McSally, but they think the Democrat is a godless baby killer.
Right.
However, I said almost all, not all. It only takes in a closely divided swing state a small portion of Republicans to vote for Trump at the top of the ticket and then ignore the rest of the ticket to help. That's as good as half a vote, for instance, in Arizona for Democrat Mark Kelly. So if you have just enough disgusted Republicans who are tired of Martha McSally, that could be the answer if the race is close. And by the way, the polls have shown that it actually hasn't been that close of a race. Now, I'm not certain that those are going to hold up until Election Day, but I would not want to be Martha McSally right now.
Right. And the other state you mentioned is Colorado, and a vote by mail state that Cory Gardner is really looking like he's the least likely to be reelected. I want to go up a little north from Colorado, though, to Montana, because that's a state that the Republicans are now having to make a serious financial investment in. And it was a state I think they thought they were going to be doing okay in. Steve Daines running for reelection until the governor, again, who's popular, Steve Bullock, decided to get in that race. So how's that shaping up?
So the most surprising development that happened in Montana came, about a week or two ago when the largest Republican super PAC, the Senate Leadership Fund, which is tied very closely to Mitch McConnell and his world, it was reported that they were going to be reserving $10 million in TV ad time for the fall race just in Montana alone. Now, I gave it that sort of exaggerated local news anchor speak of the $10 million because in Montana, that actually is a ton of money. Montana is a small state. Obviously, geographically, it's large and sprawling, but population-wise, it's quite small. Advertising there is very cheap. There's no presidential race to compete with. So if Montana is the GOP's firewall, that means that Democrats really are playing on offense because it would be awesome to flip Montana, but Democrats don't actually need to flip Montana in order to depose Mitch McConnell as majority leader of the Senate.
Right. And actually, that ditching McConnell as majority leader, I think, is an argument that will work in Maine with a lot of swing voters who see Susan Collins' fealty to him. And he's never been an issue in elections, but I feel like this year he is. One other state you mentioned when you were talking about is a state that's a Republican state, but the incumbent is having a complicated race, and actually Civics, the polling firm today, showed it's a tie race between Lindsey Graham and Jamie Harrison, 42 all. Now look, when Marcos Malitzis at Daily Kos dug into the numbers, and it does look good for Lindsey, but the fact that this race is competitive really forces Lindsey and other Republicans to have to invest in that state.
Yeah, so this was an interesting poll. Civics conducted this poll for Daily Kos, which is my employer, and it showed the race tied at 42 apiece. Now, as you were alluding, the difficulty there is that those undecided voters are kind of like what I was telling you before. It's South Carolina, it's a red state, so those undecideds lean toward Trump, and quite heavily so. And ultimately, they are going to mostly come home for Lindsey Graham. So he's still definitely the favorite. But this is something we've talked about it before. We've talked about it in regard to Mitch McConnell's own race for re-election. You keep these guys pinned down, and it forces them to campaign at home, to raise money for themselves and not for their colleagues. And also, another sort of important thing beyond winning or losing elections, you're giving voters a choice.
Right.
You know, in too many parts of the country, what people know about the Democratic Party is what they hear on Fox News, because Fox News is the only news station that they get on their cable network. And if instead you can run a vibrant campaign in a state like Georgia or Texas or South Carolina, like what Democrat Jamie Harrison is doing, then it sort of forces the media to cover you. If you have enough money, you can run ads and people actually notice your campaign. And so you're just helping spread the message that the Democratic Party is a party of good people who have good ideas, who want to help ordinary folks. And that's something that I don't think we should take for granted. It's kind of a meta issue. It won't necessarily win or lose you a specific election, but I think it's important for the health of the Democratic Party to be just healthy nationwide.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's really vital, and it's why Jamie Harrison has been on Mike's show. He was on Dean Obadala's show this week, so I really like making sure he has a platform and can get that message out. One of the things about Lindsey, too, that I find so interesting is he wants to be Trump's BFF, but it's never enough for Trump. And Gabriel Sherman at Vanity Fair last week wrote a piece about how Trump doesn't think Lindsey's doing enough on Flynn. You know, Trump wants Lindsey Graham, who is the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee, to hold hearings. He wants the fake Obamagate scandal investigated. He's going to put a lot of pressure and challenge Lindsey to do more and more. And at the same time, there was this article there, and I love this. It's so catty, and it's the kind of thing Gabriel Sherman gets into his columns. But Trump has said, since John McCain died, Lindsey follows me around and shows up to play golf, and I don't even invite him. So, like, the fact that Trump is like bad-mouthing Lindsey Graham, and Trump's not one to keep things quiet. So, Lindsey's tied himself to Trump, and we'll see how it goes, because that's, as others have learned, it's a precarious place to be.
Is there anyone who has associated themselves closely with Trump who has come out looking better on the other side? Answer, no, impossible. No. Trump only uses people, he uses them up, and he spits them out.
Right. And hopefully he can spit Lindsay out right just maybe late October for once and for all and see how that goes. But again, the fact that we're in this competitive race. The other state that we all have to keep an eye on is, of course, Alabama. Doug Jones, we know that that's going to be a tough state for him to win again. But there's a pretty ugly primary underway in the Republican side. And it's just kind of luscious because, again, talk about Republicans in disarray. This week, we saw Jeff Sessions, that noted Jefferson Beauregard Sessions, white nationalist, racist, horrible human being, in a Twitter fight with Donald Trump, who doesn't want him to be getting the GOP nomination. And then Ann Coulter siding with Sessions. It was just, I mean, get the popcorn on that one.
Yeah, I mean, enjoying nasty GOP primaries is one of the greatest entertainments that we have as election nerds. And that one is particularly delicious, as you said. Sessions was even reduced to kind of trying to stand up for himself in a pathetic tweet that was sort of telling Trump to shut up. But, like, that's not going to work either, because then you're crossways with Trump. And voters, you know, will learn about that. But I think Sessions is probably pretty doomed. Polls show him losing the runoff to his opponent, former college football coach Tommy Tuberville. But Tuberville, you know, he has some flaws of his own. He's not the notorious white supremacist Keebler elf that Jeff Sessions is, but he spent a lot of time outside of Alabama after he left Auburn, which is where he coached. He tried to sell his house repeatedly and couldn't sell his house. And that's a kind of sort of nonpartisan issue, which I don't know if Doug Jones is going to run his campaign around that, but that kind of nonpartisan issue can kind of move voters even if they're tied to Republicans. So, look, I admire Doug Jones. I think he's been an awesome senator. I think he has a hell of a difficult path to reelection. But, you know, if he got a few miracles to line up in his direction last time, maybe he'll get really lucky again.
Right. Absolutely right. David, I could keep digging into this and talk to you for hours. And I just appreciate you taking all the time today. I know our listeners love it here on SiriusXM Progress. You can be followed on Twitter at David Neer. You can also, everyone should be following at DK Elections. Sign up for the newsletter. If you go to Daily Kos Elections, sign up for the Election Morning Digest. It's really great. Every morning around 8 o'clock, you get an update on all the races, not the presidential, because a lot of people covering the presidential, but what's really great is you dig into, again, what we talked about at the beginning of this interview, where the battles are over access to voting now, and you also cover the Senate, the gubernatorial races, House races, and state legislative races, all things that are so important as we head into 2020. So David Neer, thank you again for taking the time today.
Always a pleasure, Joe. Be well.
You be well as also. Thank you so much. My name's Joe Sudbay. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back in just a few minutes.
The Michelangelo Signorile Show. SiriusXM.